All right, let's get started. Hi, everybody. My name is Kenneth. I'm president of the Oxford Psychedelic Society. This is our event, Psychedelic Capitalism. Today, we're lucky to be joined by two really cool guests, Lars Wilde, who's the president of Compass Pathways, and Alexander Beiner, co-founder of Rebel Wisdom and co-executive director of Breaking Convention. Before I get started with the event, I just wanted to note that the Oxford Psychedelic Society tries to make all of its events free and open to the public. So if you could consider making a donation to our PayPal, that would be great. Rain will send a link straight away. And we also have a new line of merchandise, which we're selling, and we will end sales tomorrow. So you should definitely try to get them while you can. Rain will also send out the link for the merch. And without further ado, I'll introduce our two guests. So Lars Wilde is the President, Chief Business Officer, and co-founder of Compass Pathways, focusing on operations, digital health solutions, and fundraising. He's an active serial entrepreneur in tech and biotech and a business angel investor, and has helped to successfully build several companies. Before joining Compass, Lars was the founder and CEO of Spring Lane, a leading European direct-to-consumer kitchen and barbecue brand, and the largest German cooking magazine. He's also previously worked as an investor at Waterland Private Equity, one of the world's best performing private equity funds. In the past, he's also spent time with the Boston Consulting Group in Munich and Sao Paulo. Alexander Beiner is co-founder of Rebel Wisdom, a media platform with 250,000 followers and a focus on sense-making and cultural analysis. He's also a co-executive director of Breaking Convention, a psychedelic education charity, which hosts Europe's largest conference on psychedelic medicine and culture. So we're going to do about an hour of moderated Q&A, followed by around 30 minutes of questions from the audience. If you come up with any questions, feel free to post them in the Zoom chat. All right, great. So first, Alexander and Lars, I was thinking you could both say in your own words what your involvement is in the psychedelic space, specifically related to psychedelic capitalism. So Lars, if you could just give us a brief intro on Compass and what you guys are up to now, and Alexander, the involvement of Rebel Wisdom in psychedelics, and also where you're currently at with Breaking Convention.
Yeah, happy to. Thanks for having me tonight and spending 90 minutes with us. That's fantastic. Look, Compass Pathways is the original brainchild of my two co-founders, Katya and George, who founded the non-profit version of Compass after their son suffered from severe episodes of mental health suffering, and they found help in ketamine and eventually psilocybin, and that got them on the path to figuring out how can we get psilocybin therapy to patients. I have a very similar story. I treated my own generalized anxiety disorder and treatment-resistant depression with psilocybin, which got me into the space. And again, I was also looking into, can we get this to patients like me in an above-the-board way? We joined forces in 2017, started the company with the goal to create a world of mental well-being by driving innovation to patients as quickly as possible in an affordable way. And our core focus is on treatment-resistant depression. That's where we are currently running a phase 2b study in 10 countries with the goal to very quickly progress with hopefully positive results into phase 3 and drive towards approval in 24-25.
Amazing. Ali?
Thanks, Kenneth. Hey, Lars. And yeah, thanks everyone for coming. Really good to be here. I mean, I've been involved in the psychedelic community for about 15 years or so, and been particularly interested in, I suppose psychedelic mainstreaming, although no one really called it that maybe 15 years ago. It was much more niche, and it's really changed a lot in a really short space of time. So I guess one of the first ways I was involved is I wrote a novel when I was in my early 20s, which isn't amazingly good when I look back on it, but and so from that, it was a novel around psychedelic culture, and so I suppose I've always been as well really interested in the culture of psychedelics and what psychedelic culture is, what psychedelics offer us in terms of personal and cultural transformation. I also care deeply about medicalization as well, and I've seen in my own life and lives of people I love how effective psychedelics can be for healing. So I currently one of the co-directors of Breaking Convention. So some people here might have been to Breaking Convention, where Europe's largest, or we host Europe's largest conference on psychedelic medicine and culture. Happens at Greenwich University every 2 years, except with a COVID break. So we're back next year. And as well as that, through Rebel Wisdom, I've been increasingly following the, well, in fact, the first film I did around this was called The Rise of Psychedelic Capitalism. So trying to speak to many different people in the field, across the field, from clinicians to researchers to activists to economists, to try and make sense of what's going on, this very rapid change in psychedelics. Yeah, I'm particularly interested in that. I'm particularly interested in the promise, I think, like many of us, are the promise that psychedelics hold, but also the risks of this very different phase we're entering. So I feel like I've been in a kind of wrestling with this quite intensely for a year or so, and my wife is actually a psychedelic researcher, and so are many of my friends. So it's always a conversation that's pretty close to me, and one that I know a lot of people are wrestling with. So it feels good to be here having this conversation together.
Amazing. So I wanted to start with a very broad, open-ended question. What is the current role of for-profit companies in psychedelic therapy, and what should it be? Ali, do you want to start?
Yes, sure. I have to say that's a very good question. A very nicely constructed question. So I'm going to start perhaps with what should it be? Because my short answer to that is I don't know. And I think really none of us really know how to kind of effectively bring psychedelics into the mainstream. We are creating it as we go. And I think for me, it's going to have to look different to what it's looked like before, because psychedelics present us with kind of a paradox. They offer a fundamentally different perspective on mental health, on ourselves, on the mind, on healing. And at the same time, they're ancient, they're deeply entwined in our history. So that space of not knowing, and coming from that space of recognizing that we don't have the models yet, in my opinion, to really know the answer to that question. But I think what we do have is an opportunity to be innovative. And that's something I'm very interested in, to create really multidisciplinary approaches to healing and to psychedelic medicine and culture. So one of the issues, and I think this is sort of the elephant in the room in many ways, and this is where a lot of the tension has been in the press, is that there is a lot of tension around the tactics and approaches that are traditionally used in pharma being applied to psychedelics. And I'm looking forward to talking to Lars about Compass's role in that, because Compass has been really at the center of that. And my concern is that those approaches won't get us to that innovative multidisciplinary space. Because even if a for-profit, and I also want to put a flag in that it's not necessarily, my argument isn't for-profit or not for profit. I think both have a place. But even with the best intentions, I think the game of the market will force organizations to come up against multiple double binds, and also very difficult incentives that are going to put pressure on the choice of profit over ethics, or what to do about competition. Shut them down, let them thrive at the risk of shareholder returns. Really difficult space. And I also believe that not just in psychedelic medicine, but in general, and this is something we talk about on Rebel Wisdom all the time and speak to people about, is that game, our old game that we've been playing so far for the last few hundred years, is no longer working. We're running out of road. And so what does a new game look like? And I think psychedelics, if there's any approach to mental health that could give us an opportunity to play a new game, it's psychedelics. And what that looks like, again, is something I'm hoping that we all figure out together. But what the old game and the game theory behind it generally selects for is a movement towards monopoly. And it might even be that players in the space don't want to move there, but that's what the game does. The game pushes us towards that. And so it means we have to pursue aggressive patent strategies, potentially to interfere in some way, to lobby, all the stuff that we see. And so that for me is an issue. And that's something I really want to kind of try and make sense of today. Yeah, just to kind of finish off, I mean, to zoom out a little bit, the story that we tell around psychedelics and how they enter the mainstream is as important to me as the fact that they're entering it in the first place. Eric Davis made a really good point in The Rise of Psychedelic Capitalism that psychedelics are unique in that the narrative we tell changes the experience we have. I can't think of anything else like that. And so if we want them to have a genuine impact on the mental health crisis, we have to focus on the how, not just the what. And that means looking at our values, looking at the epistemological assumptions we have, the choices we make, and coming from this space of humility wherever we can. And actually just the very last point is also, I think, really important to bring in very early, is that for me, psychedelics are sacred. And for many people, they're sacred. And we treat sacred things very differently in our society. We treat human life as sacred, and so one of the reasons we don't have drug companies charging huge amounts for COVID vaccines, because there's a recognition that some things transcend the profit model. And so that's something I think is very important to bring in. They're sacred to many indigenous cultures, and they're sacred to the modern Western counterculture. So yeah, I think that's where I'd like to end. It's about, we're having a conversation here about ethics. We'll probably touch on patenting and access, all really important questions without easy solutions. But I think it's also about something deeper. We're also talking about purpose, and we're talking about values, about what kind of people we want to be, and in a sense, like what we're being called to become as psychedelics enter the mainstream. So I'll stop there.
Great. Lars?
Yeah, thank you, Alexander. There were a lot of really, really good points in there. I tried to address most of them, but let me maybe get back to the question first. So I think, what is the role of for-profit? I think that means we need to get back to the question, what is a company, right? A company is a group of people coming together with a common objective to achieve something. And so I think you can't just say a company is a company, right? I think we as a company came together to say, look, there's a big problem in the way we treat people with mental health suffering today. And that needs changing, right? And that is what the team at Compass got behind, investors, other stakeholders. And that's really at the core. Now, what is the role of for-profit? Or why have we chosen for-profit, right? I think that's an important one. When I started looking at this, right, my first thought was, okay, I'm going to go to the Netherlands. I'm going to start treatment centers there, and then in the rest of Europe, I'm going to build centers where people are treated, and the ones that do not respond to standard of care can then be referred to the Netherlands, be treated there. That was my idea. Katya and George were looking at, is there a way to do this as a non-profit and drive this forward? And when we met, eventually we sat down and we went through all the options of what we could do. And we said, look, it's the fastest way that we know what we can do best is as a for-profit model. That's what we know how to execute. And in a way, our key KPI in the company is, every 40 seconds, someone on this planet commits suicide. For every person that commits suicide, 20 people try. And we said, look, this is about speed, right? This is what we're going to be measured against. And so how can we get this to patients the fastest? And that is why we said for profit. Now, I can very much relate to a lot of people that have a lot of criticism with capitalism. And I think the issue that most people have is with the American model of capitalism, or the Anglo-Saxon model in a way. But that's why we've chosen a stakeholder approach. And for us, patients come first, and only then profitability. And you see that in the mission of the company, which is accelerating patient access to evidence-based innovation in mental health. And what we mean by that is that you have two models in pharmaceutical development. You can develop a drug, and you can price it at the top of the market, targeting only a few patients. Or you can price it aggressively and try to treat as many patients as possible. Now, we're very much focused on the second model. And we very much in the very early days of Compass started working with payer institutions in Europe. Before we started the company, we were seeking advice, not only from the European Medicines Agency of where to go with psilocybin therapy, but also from payer institutions in the UK, in the Netherlands, and Norway to understand what are the questions that we need to answer for psilocybin therapy to become a reimbursed treatment. Because while I guess many people on this call have access to psychedelics and to a sitter, most people do not. And if we medicalize psychedelics for people suffering, this will be done initially in a therapeutic context that requires therapeutic oversight. When you see what the underground therapists and the above the ground therapists in the Netherlands are charging, you see that it's a couple thousand per session. Now that means if this treatment would not be reimbursed, there's no way that a large majority of people suffering from mental health disorders would be able to access that. And so that's why we said, look, we need to build this into the company from the very beginning. We build out a commercial team that's working with payer institutions, both in North America and in Europe. And then again, very concretely, what does it mean to be a for-profit entity? It's really an organization that can take in investor money and redistribute it into research. And that's what we're doing, right? We're running the largest psychedelic trial on the planet. We're going to launch a study for several studies in phase 3 that hopefully makes psilocybin as quickly accessible to patients as possible. Hopefully, someone in 2024, 2025. With all the insecurities running clinical trials, but that's what we aim for. And then in a way, I can very much relate with what Alexander said, right? I think, there are companies, they need to have strong ethical values. They need to be baked into the company. And I think that's where we are, and that's where our heart sits.
Amazing. Thank you, Lars. There's a lot to get into here. I wanted to touch on one of the points that Alexander made, which is that psychedelics are sacred substances. They're not just another pill. They have this extraordinary capacity to create life-changing spiritual experiences. So I'm wondering, Lars, if you could answer the question of how we honor the spirit of psychedelics when turning into medication, how we ensure that it doesn't just become another pill that you take.
Yeah, that is a great question. And there's, as we all know, psychedelics are a very unique experience, and it varies widely from patient or participant, if you want to participant, right? In that it depends very much on your personal frame, your cultural heritage, what you're going to experience. Now, where we have made a commitment is that we're very agnostic. So we have a mindfulness-based therapy approach to psychedelic therapy, and the therapists are not superimposing their worldview on whatever the patient experiences in our therapy, but whatever the patient experiences through psilocybin is exactly the right experience for that patient, and we work with that and make sure that the patient integrates exactly that perspective. And as you know, it's very difficult to influence the experience, right? It's in that sense, I don't think that there's a lot we can do about it. Where we are focusing is really preparing the patients appropriately, that they can be open to the experience, engage with the experience, and then work with them afterwards so that they can integrate that experience in their lives and take it into their everyday normal life.
Ali, I'm curious how you think that integration can be integrated into psychedelic therapy. How is it that we ensure that, after someone has an extraordinarily revelatory experience with psychedelics, they can actually keep that in their everyday day-to-day life afterwards?
Yeah, I mean, I'll comment on that. There's a few things I also wanted to pick up on, if that's all right, just so we don't lose any threads. But
yeah, feel free to respond to any of the threads.
Sure. Yeah. So I think integration as well as consisting of various techniques is also an attitudinal thing, and that can be built into the way that protocols are designed, because increasingly people are noticing that it's there's a malleability and a neuroplasticity that the psychedelic experience gives us, and with good therapy can be even more neuroplastic and have a lot of impact. But it's really the behavioral changes afterwards. And so that's also I know in the Imperial study, a lot of patients had the expectation, because of what they read in the press, that they were going to have a brain reset, for example, right? So there's a culture around this will reset your brain, which is of course not true. You can't just fix your problems, right? And psychedelics will not just fix your problems. which is often arguably what a kind of medical model version of psychiatry can, not always, but can push people towards. So I think there's something about building that into the culture around psychedelics, which I think is really important, as well as the actual practices. But I would be keen to just go back to this kind of question we started on and just ask a few things to Lars around I noticed that the word fastest and the kind of energy of, which I understand in a sense of, we have a mental health crisis, people are suffering, and they don't have the processes or medicines they need necessarily. But this goes back to my my concerns around innovation in the space, which I would love to talk about, because I think we have to address the fact that there's been a lot of pushback in the press around Compass's patent strategy, and the main concern, one of them, I think, which would be really good to talk about, is the fact that the patenting a polymorph of psilocybin isn't quite the same as a new chemical entity in many people's minds. So that's one thing. But the other thing is that because of Compass's first mover advantage and the fact that you have so much money and so much funding, you're able to, I'm not saying this is your intention, but you would be in a position where you could very easily make it very difficult for new players to enter the market. Because if I want to start a psilocybin company, I have to go to a VC now, and they not only do I have to get funding from the VC, but I have to get funding in case you sue me for potentially having your polymorph. And it is incredibly expensive for me to get the experts required to look at polymorph chemistry, which is very, very difficult, requires lots of expensive machinery, lots of experts. So, some lawyers that I've spoken to have compared it to sort of napalming the field and then laying landmines. So making it difficult for people to come after you, basically. And I think that's the main concern. I think it's not so much profit, or some people are concerned about capitalism. I don't think capitalism is perfect, but I wouldn't consider myself an anti-capitalist. I consider myself an entrepreneur as well. But I think it's around whether other people can play the game too. And that's something I'd really just love to talk about now, because I think it's kind of key to everything else.
Yeah, no, it's a really important question, and I would say that there's a fundamental misunderstanding of what we're doing. We're not napalming the field. Maybe I start, because I think that's in the interest of the wider group here. Historically, how did our patent strategy come about? What are we doing? So initially, when we tried to synthesize psilocybin to support the studies, we tried to work with other groups that claimed they had synthesized psilocybin. That turned out not to be true, and so we took it upon ourselves to develop a synthesis for psilocybin, or actually initially work through the existing syntheses. Now, what we learned by doing that is that the existing syntheses are not up to modern day standards. So we weren't able to produce cGMP psilocybin, which is required to run clinical trials, and that's why we first developed a new synthesis. Now, in doing so, we realized that the prior art did not hold the solution on how to manufacture significantly large batch sizes of psilocybin as required by FDA, EMA, and so forth. And so, solving a lot of problems along the way, we protected the synthesis that we had developed, where we spent significant investment on. And then when we eventually decided which of the polymorphs to develop, we found one that we found suitable for our drug product. And when analyzing that, we realized that polymorphic form had not been described in the prior art, in the work that had been done by Sandoz or anyone else. And now, maybe very briefly, what is a polymorph? Polymorph is a certain salt form of a chemical entity, and so that is what we protected. That is really what our patent strategy is based on, and then there are related claims of how you formulate that specific polymorphic form into a drug product, and what indications you use to treat with that drug product. Now, when people say we're really broad, I would say that they should talk to their favorite patent lawyer. That is not a broad patent strategy, but what it allows us is it protects the innovation that we have created. Now, why is that important? First of all, there's the understanding that people can just go about and take any idea and patent it. That's impossible. So anything that has been developed by Sandoz Pharmaceuticals or any other researcher, etc., is not patentable. That's prior art. And then some people make the argument and say, yeah, but if you have great patent lawyers and very smart, there might be patent offices where you can sneak through with such a strategy. That might be true, but not with 4 patent offices amongst the leading in the world, including the US Patent Office, the UK Patent Office, German Patent Office, Hong Kong Patent Office. So what that means is they have reviewed the prior art. They have decided that what we have done is innovative, hasn't been done before. So it requires the novel and inventive step. Why is that important to us? Because otherwise, we would be spending hundreds of millions to develop psilocybin through clinical trials to come to market. And as soon as the regulatory protection expires, we would have severe competition from generics, the Tevas of this world that would come in with hugely efficient operations that would flood the market with psilocybin, competing away any profitability with psilocybin. Now, that is not in the interest of the overall field, because if that happens, then all the companies that Alexander, you mentioned, that are now started up looking at other indications with psilocybin, DMT, 5-MeO, etc., they will not be able to raise money because then people will realize that there is no way that these investments will ever be returned. Now, without with the return objective, it's really difficult for investors to say, look, we're going to invest into late stage clinical trials, which cost hundreds of millions. Last thing I'm going to say is, luckily for the field, there has been amazing work done by Sasha Shulgin and David Nichols and many other amazing psychedelic chemists that have put a lot of information, novel chemical entities out in the public domain, and that's why you see that explosion. I think by now there are 250 psychedelic companies out there that are developing different psychedelics for different indications. And I think to some extent we have made this possible, that people realize you can actually develop these. There's enough investor interest and to take these substances through clinical trials, and that's really the focus of what we're doing.
Go ahead, Ali.
Yeah, thank you, Lars, for explaining a little bit more. I mean, it's worth mentioning that both the patent system and polymorph chemistry are super complicated. And I've spent ages looking at it. But I think it would help as well, because I think there's another aspect of this which has been reported a lot, which is what are Compass's sort of intentions with different indications? Because there have been patent applications and for basically many different indications, anorexia, even non-medical things like kind of cognitive enhancement, things related to that. So there's debate as to whether a patent office, there's a line in one of them, psilocybin or an active metabolite thereof, in one of your patent applications. So I guess what people are concerned about is that a patent office somewhere in some country may well look at your polymorph, which is a kind of temporary crystalline form of psilocybin, which sort of disappears once it kind of enters the body. It just becomes the same psilocybin, the Mazatec we're using, or that you find in fields in October here in certain places in the UK. And that then there would be a kind of perceived ownership of Compass over those indications. So I think that's where a lot of concern is. It'd be great to just hear, what your guys' intention is with it.
Yeah, that's a great question. Because we've been, as many people in this call, we met a lot of people during our time with Compass that claimed all kinds of things of what psilocybin might be able to do, right? It might treat anorexia, it might treat cognitive decline, it might treat all kinds of inflammation issues, etc. And we actually put that to the test. So we are undertaking a broad preclinical program to answer the question of what is the mechanism of action, to which psilocybin has all these effects, if they exist. So first question, do they exist? And then question is how. We're undertaking that with a very large team. We've completed, I believe, 20 studies by now or more. And we found that indeed psilocybin is a transdiagnostic tool that can be used in many indications, some of which have never been reported in the public domain. And so with that finding, we were able to file for method of use protection in these indications. Now, what that means is that we have the freedom to develop psilocybin in these indications. You mentioned a couple of the ones that we are actually actively looking at, like anorexia, bipolar, we're actively pursuing. And then there are others that we might not actively pursue. Now, we would be open to partnering with other entrepreneurs that are going to be looking at other indications that fall outside of our scope of interest. To date, we haven't been approached by anyone looking to partner with us.
I wanted to move on to another aspect of patents within psychedelic therapy. So I'm curious to get both of your takes on what aspects of psychedelic therapy you think should be patented. Obviously, psychedelic therapy is something that's been around underground for many, many years, and also in indigenous cultures. Some of Compass's past claims and patent applications have included things like whether or not the room comprises soft furniture, whether the room is decorated using muted colors, and other things. Why does Compass have a right to patent those things if they've been around in psychedelic therapy for so long?
Yeah, thanks for giving me that that question, because that is something that I absolutely want to put in the public domain. We're not patenting room furnishing, colors, soundtracks, whatever else falls into that. What you're referring to is our PCT applications that also describe set and setting. We believe that in the medicalization, these substances should be delivered safely, and there's a lot of knowledge. But I want to make that public on record here. We're not going to enforce anything related to set and setting.
Go ahead, Ali.
Yeah, so I mean, just broadly on that question, I think there's a big difference, and I think most of the people I've spoken to for my films and just in general feel very differently about patenting new chemical entities, like say an analog of MDMA without the come down, which I'm sure we'd all be grateful for, and also pre-existing molecules like psilocybin. I think that's why the polymorph is contentious, because it's a pre-existing molecule. So the aspects of the psychedelic experience, I think, of course, shouldn't and can't really be patented. Things that have been around since their prior art anyway. All of those methods have been around, and arguably that kind of ceremonial approach is borrowed from indigenous cultures around the world as well. So I don't think it can. I don't think most patent offices would do that. But it is an interesting question of what will or won't be patented, and I think it's going to come down probably to courts. I just wanted to maybe get your thoughts, Lars, on Christian Angermeyer, who's one of your investors. Because I noticed in the chat someone's asking about this, and it's something I wanted to kind of raise as well. He wrote in an email that was in Vice, which was kind of leaked. I expect a starting differentiation between solid players in the psychedelic space. And to be honest, I really just see a tie in Compass and copycats. Most of these copycats miss one important thing: patents. Many psychedelics companies out there will never be able to bring a product to market, as they will hit the patents of Compass and Atai. So, I mean, I think within the context of us talking about what can and can't be patented, I just wonder about your thoughts on that. Like, what does hitting the patents mean? What is he referring to? What do you understand by that?
I don't know what he means by that, because he's simply an investor. We're a public company, so he has zero insight into our patent strategy and any of the inner workings of the company. I'm obviously aware of that email, which seems very promotional to me, but he's not a spokesperson of the company, so it's really not our opinion that's represented there.
That's fair enough. I actually wanted to take one of the questions from the audience, since it's pertinent to this. This is from Rebecca Harding. How is aggressively patenting various protocols helping widen access to psychedelics, which you say is your main ambition, supposedly with Compass Pathways. And how does protecting your innovation through patenting not inadvertently end up blocking access for other psychedelic companies to create their own therapies and medications?
Yeah, I think the first one I answered, right? What I said is that, we're not patenting room colors or laying down or putting on eye shades and earphones. And I mean, Alexander summarized it really well, right? This is in the public domain. This is not something that will be ever enforced. Now, the other question is, how does it help with access? And I think that's a bit more of a complicated question that requires a longer answer, right? So again, I think without any protectable business model, it won't be possible for any of these companies to raise the required funding, which, if you look at treatment-resistant depression, we're talking somewhere between 300 to 500 million to get psilocybin approved, right? If you think about all the other indications where people would benefit from psilocybin therapy, similar amounts of money will be required for that. Now, without a defensible business model, no one will raise this amount of money. I think when you think about, who's going to deliver psychedelic therapy, we're already now seeing an explosion of providers, right? You see in the US, a lot of ketamine clinics being set up that are looking to integrate MDMA, next generation TMS, psilocybin, whatever else comes down through the clinical pipeline. And you're going to see a lot of interesting developments on the provider side of things that will grant access. Now, the question is, how can we very quickly develop psilocybin so that these providers can start treating patients? And that is where we are focused, right? I think that's one of the things that also has been maybe at some point in time been misunderstood. We're not going directly into the delivery. We're going to be the partner of delivery groups. You see a lot of new entities being set up to deliver treatments. The situation in Europe is different. We still, we're looking to partner with existing healthcare systems like the NHS and Priory Group, Virgin, Media, and a lot of other potential partners in Europe that then can deliver these treatments at scale to patients, because patients can't wait.
I wanted to shift gears because the discussion on psychedelic capitalism is multifaceted. And I wanted to ask specifically about how you think that we can create specific measures to avoid exploitation of indigenous lands and culture. This is a question taken from Valeria in the audience. How is it that Western psychedelic medicine in a for-profit context can respect past indigenous cultures that have used psychedelic medicine?
I'll let Alexander answer that first.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think I've come across, again, this is not to say my main area of expertise, but I have been speaking to people and kind of come across various different models. One is some kind of reciprocality to indigenous groups where these practices came from. I think it's an important idea. I also think it's difficult to implement, and I think it's quite new. So I think there's a lot more work to be done in kind of figuring out what that looks like and how it works. I see it as applying particularly to ayahuasca and potentially psilocybin, but in different ways. And there's also it raises a really interesting question as well, because it raises the question of what worldview are we selecting for as psychedelics enter the mainstream? If I have a psychedelic experience in a clinic or now in a clinical trial, and I have a past life experience, or I have an encounter with an entity, what ontology, what worldview am I going to be making sense of it through? Probably not CBT, because it's like a bit out of the realm, right? Maybe Jungian model, but there are many different models out there from different cultures. And in a sense, there's a kind of there's a tension between our worldviews, between worldviews, let's say. So it's a mistake to import, like, say, a Shipibo model and mix it with a bit of Buddhism and a bit of Hinduism and create some kind of mishmash worldview and have people try and interpret the experience through that. And I think it's also a mistake to only use our frames. And so there's a certain I think importance of respecting and honoring and really genuinely listening to indigenous ways of knowing. And what that looks like practically on the ground, it kind of remains to be seen. But maybe I'll pass over to Lars.
Yeah, no, it's a really complicated field, right? To think about reciprocity here, and which cultures are you looking at? Obviously, mushrooms have been used around the world. I mean, they have been used by our ancestors in Europe as well. So that's one thing to consider. So at the moment at Compass, we're very much focused on running clinical trials and answering the question of how can we generate access for patients. That's at the core. Obviously, we were taking in these, I want to say, feedback points to think about, is that something that we want to engage with in the future? And we like to be in the discussion. At the moment, we don't have a good answer for that question.
So just to elaborate actually on a point that Ali was making, Lars, does Compass make any effort to create a certain kind of worldview through which you can frame the experiences you have on psychedelic therapy or medicine, or has that just not been developed yet?
No, I think, look, this again is, we feel very strongly about that any patient's experience is the right experience to work with that individual patient. And as Alexander said, right, it can be very different from patient to patient. So the focus is really on processing the experience, integrating the patient's very experience, and helping them to make sense of that experience and what that means for their life specifically. So it's a very individualized approach.
Kenneth, could I return to a previous point? Would that be okay?
Absolutely, go for it.
I'm noticing again stuff in the chat, and I'm just keen to kind of get a kind of bit of collective intelligence going. Yeah. But we should have already talked about alternatives to the for-profit model as we know it, and there are many. And as people are pointing out in the chat, there is USONA, who have a commitment to open science, who are also in phase 2 and also have a synthesis of psilocybin. And then of course there's MAPS, MAPS is a great example of what can be done philanthropically and with things like data exclusivity, which is something Rick Doblin argues for, rather than patents, having the kind of exclusive control of your data and being able to profit and be paid for the risk you've taken through that. I think that is something I would love to talk about with Lars, because the model of the pharma model, where you get rewarded for the risk you take, is usually for bringing a new drug to market. But again, psilocybin is not a new drug. It's a pre-existing molecule. And so I'm not saying that Compass hasn't taken any risk, but I'm saying that the risk that you've taken is not the same as the risk of bringing a completely new drug to market. Perhaps you disagree with that, but I would love to hear, Lars, about the alternatives that are out there, including USONA, for example.
Yeah, there were a couple of questions in that. Let's maybe talk about MAPS first, right? What a tremendous success. Been talking to the MAPS team earlier today, and I'm obviously a big fan of their work. They have a good chance of getting MDMA across the finish line within the next, call it 2 years. And they have done that in an amazing fashion, right, as a nonprofit. I think what I would say is it took them quite some time, right? We're talking about 35 years here to get to the point. And I think when we looked at it, we said, look, it's going to be very, very difficult for us to raise the amounts of funding required in depression studies, with much larger patient numbers required due to the variability, the intersubject variability that you have to raise these funds philanthropically. We didn't know how to do it. And I think Rick has a really good point, right? Focus on data exclusivity. We're doing the same. Obviously, any drug that's been developed to market will, that's a new drug, will enjoy data exclusivity. So MDMA is a new drug because it hasn't been developed all the way to market. Similarly, psilocybin will be, from the regulatory perspective of the FDA, MHRA, EMA, be a new chemical entity, new active substance, which lets us access data exclusivity. And look, I think, I applaud all models, right? If USONA is successful with developing psilocybin and major depressive disorder, that's phenomenal for patients. Best of luck with that. We know that it takes a lot of work, especially on not only running the clinical trials, because I feel that there are two ways where, or there are three ways where any drug could fail, right? One is can't be safe, can't be efficacious, and it can't be commercialized. Now, I think most people on this call would probably say that psilocybin has a good chance of being safe and efficacious. So where psilocybin could fail is on the commercialization front. And what I mean by that is, can we get it to patients? And again, to get it to patients, you cannot only run regulatory relevant studies, but you actually need to run studies that allow you to see what the utility for healthcare systems of providing that treatment will be. Now, those are much larger studies required, because in the current situation is, you're depressed, you go to your GP, the GP says, oh, you're not feeling well, we're going to give you an SSRI. Now, the SSRI doesn't work, you come back, you're going to be put on another SSRI or an SNRI. If that doesn't work, tricyclic or atypical antipsychotic. The problem with that is these drugs are all genericized, so they're very cheap. And the problem is that psilocybin will have to be compared against that on an efficacy weighted basis. That's why we're very much focusing on treatment-resistant depression. That's where the cost for the system is the highest. So direct cost of a patient suffering with treatment-resistant depression is between $17,000 to $25,000 a year. Since these patients do not improve, that's a recurring cost. And that's what we're focusing on the commercial side, is running the clinical trials that are required to also generate that evidence. And that creates a large part of the cost, right? And I feel that the comparison between MAPS and Compass is in so far incorrect that MAPS is going after chronic PTSD, which does not have any accepted treatment. So they're going to be first in class. They can demand any price. Their treatment is going to be very expensive. When you think about it, it's 3 MDMA sessions, 2 therapists with a lot of therapy before and after. And they will be able to probably charge for it with some health insurances. The goal here must be to create something similar in a much more competitive field, where existing drugs are out there for treatment-resistant depression, where we need to show we can be competitive. Again, many roads lead to Rome, and the one that we understood the best is the one that we're pursuing. That doesn't mean that others might not work, right?
Just on that, I'd love to pick up on that. Another model, which is neither the pharma profit model or not-for-profit model, is the Oregon model. And Oregon is currently in the phase of having legalized psilocybin for therapeutic use, now in the phase of figuring out how to best do it. It's going through the state healthcare, and that is a completely different model. And Lars, I wonder, I'm curious whether you are worried about that model, because just realistically, doesn't it pose if other states start rolling that out and the model shifts from the clinical trial model, bring drug to market, to natural psilocybin, and being used by trained therapists funded by the state, that seems to be quite a threat to you guys.
Yeah, no, I disagree. It's a good point that you bring it up, but I disagree, right? It's an alternative model, and I think the people of Oregon have voted. So kudos to them. The issue you're going to have here is if you don't develop a drug through the regulatory models, the health insurances will not reimburse it. So while it might be great, depending on whatever the model shapes out to be in Oregon, that some people can access it, the question is still, if a patient has to access psilocybin therapy a couple of times with a therapist, let's do a quick calculation. Let's say you keep it very lean, right? You have only one therapist, you have 2 preparatory sessions, you have 2 integration sessions, and the day is maybe 8 hours, right? That gives you a total number of 12 hours. And the average cost of a therapist in the US is somewhere between $100 and $200 an hour. So the average psilocybin session will cost between $1,200 and $2,400 US dollars. The question is, who can really afford that, especially, maybe a few times a year. It's going to be far in between that people can access that. Now, it's a great model for the people that can afford it. That's not what we're focused on. we're focused on the average depressed person that we want to support, right? And for that, our view is we need to develop it through the medical model. And there will be very many other models, right? I think I'm applauding decriminalization, right? I think no one should go to jail. I think the decrim model is a bit misguided because very few people go to jail for psychedelic use. Most people go to jail for, if they're black, they go to jail because of marijuana use or crack cocaine use. That's really the majority of people in jail, but in the United States. And I think, it's great that drugs are increasingly decriminalized. That's where the focus should be. You're going to have probably a recreational use model where people will have other ways to access it. You see that in the Netherlands, a lot of centers are flourishing there, synthesis, etc. They are overbooked. Again, the sessions cost thousands of dollars. And that limits access, right? The only thing that will provide access is reimbursement. And again, that's what we're focused on. I also feel that the debate is in kind of the psychedelic world is very much US centric, right? And, who knows how the US situation will shape up. But if we look at Europe, right, when we think about the UK and Germany and the other larger European countries, they can't even legalize cannabis, right? So what are the chances that such a model will be successful in Europe? Very slim. And so I feel that for patients at the moment, the biggest chance is to go through the medical route, do the work required, work with the system, deliver the data, and get the treatments approved. That's our focus. Overall, I think, we're all in the same boat, right? We want to get psychedelics across the finish line. There are different approaches, and there's not going to be a monopoly. I'm sure of that. So there are going to be others out there. But yeah, I'd love to know, Alexander, what is the alternative model? Let's say, there was no Compass and there was no psychedelic Renaissance movement. How would you think this could get to patients successfully?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, as best as I understand it from the research I've been doing, I mean, I think Usona's model is one that I can see working. The other thing is that I notice a lot of what you're saying is around a strategy of speed and kind of getting it rolled out quicker rather than slower. I personally don't think that's a good idea because I don't think we're ready for it, and I don't think our existing systems are set up for that. I like the work of Bennett Zellner, who's an economist who's worth checking out. He talks about the pollination approach, which is where we have much more of a grassroots focus. And we actually speak to the underlying causes of the mental health crisis, which are to do as much, depending on who you talk to, with a deep lack of meaning and purpose in culture, a deep sense of economic disenfranchisement, a loss of connection, a loss of community. We're seeing in a lot of studies that it's as beautiful and amazing as psychedelic assisted therapy is, it's not really just that, and it alone even doesn't work. It's also connection to other people, connection to community, a reason to do what you do, a reason to get up in the morning. We live in a culture which, for one of the first times in history, we don't really know what our culture is for, or where we're meant to be going. So there are there's a meta crisis and a meaning crisis. So, and on the practical level, I think again, something like Usona's model, something like many different players in an IP commons. And that, the question of pricing, I think is an interesting one. I think the idea of the insurance model, I know Shayla Love has questioned that in one of her Vice pieces. She argued that it's a bit of a red herring because in the US, insurers are notoriously bad at covering psychotherapy and network. So it doesn't inherently ensure coverage, and it doesn't ensure that people who have health insurance in the first place, or insurance with low enough deductibles to access coverage. And likewise in the UK with the NHS, for example, the NHS has problems with certain cancer drugs because only one company has a monopoly on it. So let's say you did have exclusivity for, say, 5 or 10 years, and it was only Compass psilocybin available in the UK, you would be in a position potentially to charge what you wanted to the NHS, and either they say yes or they don't do it. I'd be curious, what would you want to charge? Because if that model is indeed the best, how does that work? How do you make a decision to charge an ethical amount? Who decides what's an ethical amount?
Yeah, Great question. And I just want to say I have a hard time following the chat, and I try to focus on you, Alexander, when you speak. So maybe Kenneth, you can call out the more interesting questions in the chat. I'm sorry that I'm not reading all of them. I just saw one on, there was also touching on the health insurance part. And I think, this is something that's very relevant, because I think in Europe, we will absolutely get to a model, right, where people, we will, if psilocybin turns out to be a good therapy for patients, we will find a way to get it reimbursed and to patients. And then the question is, will entrepreneurs and existing systems quickly enough set up treatment rooms and centers to actually deliver the treatment? And we try to support that, but that's not what Compass will be doing. So I hope other entrepreneurs will be very active in that. The other market that is, or the only market in the Western world that's really a huge problem is the United States, because of a broken healthcare system, where indeed people that probably need psilocybin therapy the most will have a problem accessing it because of an underinsurance problem or no insurance. And that is something that we're thinking about, and how to address that, and thinking through solutions for that. Now, it's not our fault that the healthcare system in the United States is broken. But I think for us, it's important to mention we're looking for a solution. And that will very much depend on, going to your question, what will be the pricing, right? I think we're very committed. I think it's one of the first sentences in our mission to access, which means affordable pricing. That's the focus of everything that our commercial unit is doing at the moment. It hugely depends on the results of the phase 2B and our long-term follow-up study, which will answer, what is the average duration of the antidepressant response? How much do we lower the cost for the system, so that we can answer reliably what the pricing of that therapy might be. Unfortunately, we don't have the data yet. We're very excited, waiting for it. Will be with us hopefully before the end of the year. And we hope that we then have a bit of a better understanding. Finally, that answer will only be given in the phase 3, once we know more about efficacy and long-term durability.
Great. I did promise that we would have at least 30 minutes of questions asked from the audience, which I already tried to integrate into the discussion. We've got a lot of questions from the audience. I first wanted to start off with an audience member who happens to be right next to me. Tiffany, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, I do. Hi, it's nice to meet you both. This is such an awesome discussion. I think shout out to Valeria in the chat. You've been asking some questions that I also have. I appreciate, Lars, the honesty of your own narrative. I sort of try to endorse that in my own life. I am a medicinal marijuana patient, and sort of firsthand experience for my own conditions how, substances that are scheduled move from FDA approval to adoption, and then ultimately to someone like me. And it isn't a pretty picture. So I guess I'm trying to think about, realistically, how do we avoid what happened with weed and what happened with K, what happened with, medical marijuana and what happened with medical ketamine? Because obviously it's, super complex, but I can't help but think there's just so much about, how we interface with regulatory bodies, and not just talking about, in the USA, obviously there's the complexity of state level regulation of these substances as well. But, patients in long-term care facilities with marijuana in their pockets, with medicinal marijuana program, are being removed from their long-term care facilities for possessing marijuana because it's a scheduled drug, which makes no sense, right? So I'd love to think through with you guys, how can we interface with regulatory bodies to prevent what happened with weed and K?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think there are some similarities, but there are also a lot of differences, I would say, because, let's take marijuana, where you have the natural plant, right? And that has been first decriminalized in some states in the United States, and then medical use of the flower has been made available. And so that took a lot of incentive away from research. So while you have that major explosion of cannabis accessibility in the United States, the issue is that you have very little research happening with marijuana. There are only, I believe, 3 major pharmaceutical companies left in the space exploring what these compounds do, and that means that there's no funding, and so people moved on. And so what you're left with are the Tilrays and the Afrias of the world that are trying to create fancy new edibles and combination of things without actually researching it. And I believe the cannabis plant has a lot to offer for patients, and it's actually a pity that it's not being explored. And I hope the same doesn't happen to psychedelics, right? If you take away the motive to fund research, you're not going to get the answers. And maybe you get to some patients, but you're not going to get the big answer of what these substances would be able to do. I think you also mentioned ketamine. I think for ketamine, it's a similar situation in that a lot of off-label use has happened, and people have started paying out of pocket for it. Some insurers have, in the States, have started to pay for racemic ketamine. Janssen, pharma arm of Johnson & Johnson, developed S-ketamine. Now they were suddenly coming into a market where the psychiatrists make much more money from selling racemic ketamine out of pocket, where they charge $600 a pop. They pay 50 cents for a vial of ketamine, so the net profit is $600 for the administration. So they don't want to deliver S-ketamine. So S-ketamine, which is reimbursed, didn't make it to patients because the providers in that case said, look, I make a lot of money with my little practice here, charging people out of pocket, so I'm not interested in providing S-ketamine. Now, I think that situation is rectified. I believe that now some of the insurers are starting to pay for the administration actually of Spravato, which is S-ketamine, and so that will then facilitate that actually these sites can deliver S-ketamine, and so that it actually reaches the people that need it. And so there's a lot to be learned from these cases for all of us in psychedelics on how to get it right. And so we're obviously deeply analyzing these cases to not make the same mistakes again.
Ali, did you want to touch on that briefly as well?
Yeah, just briefly. I mean, again, there's a question of what are we mainstreaming psychedelics for? Are we mainstreaming them to fix a problem that we perceive? Because if we're doing that, then I think we're going to be sitting here in 20 years talking about the fact that the latest shiny thing in psychiatry, psychedelics, it ain't working no more. And now we need to invest all our money in VR, AI assisted therapy, right? And I think that the reason that comes up for me is because, okay, use the cannabis example. When you mentioned, Lars, around that there's a lack of incentive for more research, I don't know whether that incentive has to, like, this perpetual incentive for the market to keep growing is part of the problem, I think. And I think the whole conversation we're having here is about alternative modes of approaching things. Because when do we stop? When do we, let's say we're 20 years from now, there's psychedelic clinics everywhere, pretty much every indication is covered. When do we stop that? And like, if we have an incentive structure that is to keep it growing, we need to keep giving people reasons to take psychedelics. So we need to have billboards like, hey, you feeling upset? Yeah, just go through a breakup, LSD. That's the problem. The problem is the inbuilt incentive structure. And this is not an anti-capitalist argument so much as a perverse incentive argument. And so I think to prevent it going that way is to clean up the incentive structure now before it's too late.
I think, again, we need to discriminate between mainstreaming psychedelics for anyone who wants to work on their own insights, better understanding themselves, their place in the world, and people that are suffering from severe mental illness, which is our focus at the moment. And I think, again, I think that needs the funding required that we were talking about and the incentives to actually deliver the research. One point that you made is probably true that I wanted to go back to, right? When you talk about, why is the world suffering? Why is mental health exploding? And I agree with everything you said, right? It's a disease of disconnection from ourselves, from our environment, from nature, etc. And I think, the benefit that psychedelics have, and research has shown that, is that people better understand how to lead their lives, what the real priorities are. And so if people really believe in kind of the power of psychedelics to help people rectify their perception of what's important in their life, right? Then I would say, we're all in the same boat, right? If people come out of these experiences better understanding themselves, their place in the world, that it's better to spend time with the people that are closest to you, that matter to you, instead of running after the next shiny thing, I think, then our goals of helping patients are aligned with your goals and bringing about a psychedelic renaissance, right? And so I don't feel that there is a disconnection between kind of the objectives of the wider psychedelic community and the psychedelic medicalization.
I did want to move on to more questions just in the interest of time. This one does relate to the previous discussion about what we should do once there's no longer an incentive to take psychedelics, as well as the earlier discussion in Oregon. The question is from Flores. She's asking, should one be allowed to use psychedelics without having any quote unquote disease? Are you worried that putting it in the medical field might be too narrow?
Yeah, I think, look, again, we're a mental health care company, right? That's really important. I think we're not a psychedelics mainstreaming company. If there was any other treatment that was equally promising as psilocybin, we would also develop that treatment if it doesn't deliver the psychedelic experience. Now we believe psilocybin happens to be one of the best treatments for patients. That's not to say that we would be opposing people accessing psychedelics outside of mental health treatments. It's just not what we are doing, right? And that's why we applaud all the efforts out there, right? The decrim efforts that are very successful at the moment in the United States. Maybe something like that can take shape here. And I think what Alexander said is, we need to eventually answer the question: why is the whole world getting depressed, anxious, developing neuroses, etc., right? And because that is what's happening, right? COVID has further worsened that, and we got to deal with that mental health crisis. And I think psychedelics will be part of the solution, but as you said, it's not a magic bullet, right? I think that's also important that people understand. It's not, popping a pill and, resetting your brain and you're good to go, right? It takes work. People need to be actually willing to engage with the therapy. It needs a lot of very skilled therapists to work with these patients. We need the infrastructure for that. Now, I believe over the course of a lifetime, right, kind of what our mantra is at Compass: everybody has a story. Either yourself has experienced some mental health suffering, or someone in your family has experienced it, or a circle of friends. Everybody's touched by this, directly or indirectly. Now, this happens over the course of our lives, right? We get traumatized by events. We're stuck in a situation of learned helplessness. There's a situation we can't free ourselves from. And so we will always go through these waves. Now, that's where psychedelics could be very useful, right? Especially in times of turbulent change. And the question is, eventually, could these treatments be given preventatively? That we don't have to wait for someone to end up in a severe mental health crisis, right? Is there a way that these substances could actually be seen as more of a mental health vaccine? The only place to go there is through research and answering these questions. Otherwise, the regulators will not entertain that thought.
Yeah. I'm a big believer in the necessity of clinics and churches. And I think we're only at the beginning of the, right now, because of medicalization, psychiatry and the regulatory bodies have the say over access in terms of someone gets psychedelics because they're sick. Now, I think that's by itself an issue. I think sometimes they're rightly placed to do that. But I think, like we were talking about with the crisis of meaning, what if someone's rabbi says, what's really wrong with them is that they're in a deep space of mistrust with God, and they need a psilocybin session that we do in our way to reconnect them to that. That is also now going to be like, those things can and should coexist, but they have to coexist if we're in a flourishing ecosystem. And Lars, I think what I'm feeling is kind of, I know we're close to ending, but what I'd love to just touch on and hear from you is, Compass is a significant part of the psychedelic ecosystem right now. You're not separate from it. And sometimes I felt a little bit like you guys are a big bear and you're being like, well, we're just, we want everyone to be kind of, flourishing in the ecosystem, but the bear, especially with the with the kind of press and the patenting strategy, is very scary to a lot of people. And scary, people are also worried, perhaps needlessly, about what role Compass might play, say 10 years down the line in decrim, etc. Like, is it your intention not to go after, say, Usona or other companies for their patents? Is it kind of, do you want that kind of ecosystem, or I would love to just hear from you what the intention is.
Yeah. Yeah, look, I think going back to your point, right? If the rabbi decides that you're having a spiritual crisis, right, and you should access psilocybin, I think that's great. It's not what we do, right? I think this would be a desirable world where people have freedom over their consciousness and they can do whatever they want. Again, to me, the problem is not psychedelics, right? On that question, it's if in a grown-up society, right? I feel that people, as long as they don't touch the freedom of others, they should be free to do whatever they want, right? And I feel, humanity is slowly moving in that direction. Some countries faster, some countries slower. I'm hopeful we're going to get there. Now, what role does Compass play in that? We're clearly not opposing this. We're supporting that. I think Decrim is a great initiative. There are great examples here. When you look at Portugal, it has shown they got rid of the opioid crisis through decriminalization and treating people with addiction not as criminals, but as people that are suffering. The Czech Republic has shown that this model is replicatable. And I think that, I hope the world overall moves towards that direction. Now, how can Compass help and all the other players, right? We're very much focused on Compass, but again, there are 200 psychedelic companies out there. I hope what it does is, right, when you see millions of people suffering today, hopefully being able in a couple of years' time to access psychedelic therapy, they will be out there with their stories, right? And you see that now, you see that in the trials that Robin Card-Harris had done with TRD. There are some amazing vocal patients that have come out of it and said, look, this is how much psilocybin therapy has helped me. We're seeing the same now in the MDD trial where patients are out there talking about it. And, this will create a huge wave of advocacy. When I think about this, if we fast forward, 10 years down the road, you have psychedelic treatment centers in every little village. People that are suffering are able to legally access this, maybe decrim. Then you have all the arguments. You're probably going to have the population behind you to make a case and say psychedelics should be available for everyone. We have a framework. We have places to go to. This can be done safely. So I think, the more successful the psychedelic renaissance on the medicalization side is, the more successful all other movements will be. So again, it's the rising tide will lift all boats here. So I'm extremely positive about the overall field.
Thanks, Lars. I noticed, I have to say, this is coming up in the chat, I noticed you didn't mention whether you would sue companies if you
Oh yeah. No, I mean, absolutely. Look, we would absolutely enforce our IP, right? I mean, otherwise we wouldn't file for IP. So I think that's really important. I've always said that, and again, right? I think that's we're not going to talk about any active litigation. We're never going to go after any researcher, clinic provider, etc. If somebody is infringing on our concrete IP, eventually this could lead to a case of litigation. But I don't have a crystal ball and I can't answer what the future will look like.
Yeah, thank you.
I wanted to shift to another question from Ada. This is also relating to the discussion on just, how people can get access to psychedelic medicine broadly. Would in promotion of many independent psychedelic clinics and centers help to deliver therapy to multitudes of people fast, rather than one or several companies dominating the market? And again, this goes back to what you were talking about, Ali, at the beginning, the old game being the monopoly taking control of psychedelic medicine.
The question is about treatment center, Kenneth. Did I get that right?
Yes, psychedelic clinics and centers.
Yeah, I think, you're gonna, as everywhere, you're gonna see an explosion of centers. You see that today in the United States, which is, I believe, from everything we're seeing, the farthest advanced with ketamine, different ways of administering ketamine, also in a psychedelic container, in a way with preparation and integration in some of these clinics. Others are pure places of administration. I think there's going to be a winning model in the end, but again, right, when we look at the delivery of psychotherapy, I think that's a great analogy here. You have hundreds and hundreds of players. And so you're going to see the same with psychedelic therapy providers.
Yeah, I mean, I think I spoke to this point. This is kind of my entire framing from the beginning. So I would just reiterate that I think a healthy ecosystem with a multidisciplinary approach, where very actually similar to something like the American Constitution, where you create something anti-fragile, i.e. resilient from the outset, so that there's many different approaches, and that for me is where innovation happens. It's multiple different perspectives happening at the same time, that are free to do that and don't have regulatory hurdles or other professional hurdles to overcome. And I think the big question that none of us have solved yet is how to take the best of the medical model, which is regulation, and making sure that people, you know, if you're a bad doctor, you're a bad psychologist, there are consequences for that. If you're a bad underground healer, you don't really have consequences for that. Maybe eventually you get called out, but like, you know, there's a lot of harm in the underground as well. There's a lot of harm in the medical system too, you know, iatrogenic illness. So illness that's caused by medicine is you know, a significant problem. But overall, you know, I wouldn't go for surgery just like in a back alley with some guy with a scalpel, because I'm like, well, you know, that's crazy. So I think figuring out, as we have clinics, churches, whatever other iteration of places people go for healing or growth, that we have some, yeah, like I was going to say ethics pledge, but it's more than that, because it has to have teeth. It has to have consequences to it. It has to be some sense of regulation. But then the question is, who regulates it? And that's a big open question. But I think there's, again, space for innovation in that. There's new ways to do it.
I mean, I 100% agree with you, Alexander. I think this is, you know, I've been shocked, quite frankly, with some of the stories I heard from the underground, but also from therapists that have been involved in some of the clinical trials with MDMA, of what has happened in terms of abuse and mischief making with patients. I think that's horrible. If you think about people that, you know, some of these patients are so depressed, they're close to suicidal ideation, right? And they're in such a fragile state. They need to be protected at all costs. But that's where I say, you know, that's why we're doing what we're doing. That's where regulation comes in, right? A good example is we're video recording, audio recording every session for the benefit of the patient, so they know exactly, even if they have been completely dissociated during the experience or whatever happened to them, that they will be able to see what the conduct of the therapist in the session has been, for example. And so I think this is crucially important. And I think that is one thing when we think about the overall movement, right, where this could be shut down, right? A couple of things that go wrong in terms of abuse or people doing stupid things on psychedelics. You know, thousands of people are doing stupid things on alcohol every weekend, right? And nobody cares. But the spotlight will be on psychedelics. And I think that's something that we as an overall field need to be very careful with, to do anything in our power to prevent any of that from happening. I think MAPS is doing some amazing work at the moment in educating law enforcement in states that are decriminalizing how to deal with people that are freaking out during a psychedelic experience and how to calm them down, etc. Those are great initiatives. Now, I'm scrolling through the chat here. I think there was a question, you know, are we opposed to decriminalization in Oregon? Absolutely not. You know, we're very much in favor of decriminalization, 100%.
Yeah, just briefly to your point, Lars, just I think it's the yes and, right? I think is always important, because as well as having bad stuff happening in the underground, there's also, you know, incredible indigenous healers, there's incredible people in the underground. I've spoken personally to people running clinical trials who've spoken to underground therapists because they have just far more experience than anybody else. So I think that's a really important point to make. And equally, the fact is that there are incentives in the medicalization model that are also difficult to navigate, you know, because there's an incentive right now as well to, whether anyone's acted on it, I don't know, but there's an incentive to not talk too much about adverse events because everyone wants to get this stuff through. And also there's an incentive to not, to also, this happens with all science. I don't think it's just the psychedelic space, but there's an incentive for studies to be interpreted a certain way, for data to be interpreted a certain way. Money in science is a huge issue as well. And so there's something, my sense is that there is a new form of being able to bring psychedelics into the mainstream, which accounts for all this complexity and never boils it down into one way of knowing. Because really this is a question of power. It's a question of who is in control of access, who has the decision over access. And I think that's why, for me, an ecosystem where power is dispersed evenly, like the US Constitution, this was the question they had: how do you prevent bad actors? How do you create a system where power can't accumulate too much in one area? And it just about worked, even with Trump. I mean, it almost broke, but sort of just about worked. So astonishing things can happen when we all sit down and figure out, how do we really want this to roll out? And that's where my concern with the speed at which everything is happening comes from, because I think there's just so much we don't know.
I agree. Look, I mean, they're amazing, to your point, they're amazing underground therapists. There's a lot to be learned from them. We're blessed to be working with some of the people that have done psychedelic research in the 1960s and 70s already. Bill Richards, one of our therapist trainers in the United States, now doing research at Hopkins. Obviously, he has a lot of experience under his belt, and there's a lot to be learned from him for young therapists. That's why we're working with these people. And again, a lot is culturally influenced and should be put to research, right? We should figure out what works, what doesn't work. We should, find all different places for generating innovation that can be tested. I think that's where research comes in. I think I actually see this space very much distributed, right? You have the decriminalization efforts, you have the legalization efforts, you have the underground, you have the companies developing this, you have the infrastructure being rolled out. So, I believe in free markets, and I think, over the course of the next 10 years, the most promising model for patients and then for people that generally want to access psychedelics will win. And eventually the customer decides in any market, right? It's not going to be the company superimposing the best model. The vote is with the therapist, with the patient and with the consumer.
Great. I know we've got tons of more questions from the audience, but we are 5 minutes away from the end of the event, and we've covered a lot of different threads today. So I was wondering if our two speakers just wanted to give some final closing thoughts to wrap everything up.
I think I went first at the beginning, so maybe if Lars, you wanted to
go for it. Go for it, Ali. Yeah.
No, I'm handing it to Lars for
Lars.
Yeah, look, I appreciate the opportunity to be here today and to receive all these questions and be able to answer them. I want to reiterate, we're in it to create a world of mental well-being. We're deeply focused on patients. We're in our mission statement where we're saying that we're all about accelerating access to evidence-based innovation and mental health. And I think that's what I want to make clear again is, we're not in the wider let's legalize psychedelics movement. We leave that to others that are much better in that than we are. Our focus is on medicalization and really getting psilocybin therapy and in the future other therapies to patients at an affordable price. Now again, when we think about the wider psychedelic fields, many roads lead to Rome. I believe that this will be a thriving ecosystem where many players can be successful. And I would hope that we inspire a couple of people to also come up with innovative solutions. I feel there's a lot of blame out there, and I feel that there's very little solution offer and very little innovation happening. Where I feel this is a space that needs people that go out there, that start clinics, that start new companies, and get really involved, not only in activism but in doing things. And I think we can do that together. I enjoy these conversations. There was a lot of food for thought that I'm going to take on board and think about. So thank you very much for your time tonight.
Yeah, I wanted to say thank you, Lars, for taking the time as well. I know you haven't done so many of these recently. It's much appreciated. It's been good to actually have a conversation around it. So yeah, what comes up for me is that, like, my hope for the psychedelic renaissance beyond and including medicalization is that the promise of psychedelics and the way they change how we see ourselves and the world spreads through culture. I think that's the real promise of them. And I'm not a fan of the word well-being so much because I don't know what we're being well for. I'm not sure this is a culture worth being well for right now. But I think psychedelics give us the creativity, the insight, the energy, the rebellious attitude, and the magic to figure out what that is. And I think that's where we're at realistically, is figuring out who are we, where are we going, why are we so sick? And that's what I want psychedelics to do. Not to do, I mean, to inspire us towards is probably a better way to say it. And yeah, and together with that is a sense of a kind of psychedelic approach to how they're mainstreamed, and this kind of multiplicity and complexity to it. So that's what my kind of deepest hope is for the space.
Well said. Thank you, Alexander, for the debate.
Yeah, and with that, yeah, I really want to thank Lars and Alexander for joining us today. It's been a real treat to hear from you both. And thank you so much to all the audience members for attending. We'll see you at our next event.
Thanks so much. Have a good night.
Bye.
Take care.